like a collaborative space. So anyone that has kind of been in multiple spaces with me, you know, it's really about collaboration and working together. So I'm really excited about, you know, my dear friend and I consider colleague, Roya, being able to join me in this. We've been really learning about this together in a very grassroots way, I think. So we're excited to apply that learning here with you. So I'm going to jump right in and so just move us forward a few slides. So this is some of, like, you know, what Mika was sharing earlier. And then here's a little bit about us. So, you know, like, again, you know, just share a little bit of our background and what we're bringing to the table. I'm always excited about what you all are bringing to the table. So it'll be kind of a cooperative experience. And then from here, I really want to just kind of dive into, you know, this conversation. So sorry, I think I moved too quick. When we talk about this, you know, this conversation around racial prejudice or oppression, I always want to start with, like, kind of like a baseline of who we are and where we can move from. And so I believe we're all spiritual beings. And because we're spiritual beings, we operate with spiritual principles, right? So there are spiritual principles that motivate us, that move us, and also guide us, right? And so without those, then you'll leave it up to human beings to create principles that aren't necessarily going to be coherent with the way that we were created. And so when you think about spiritual principles, there's three ways that I'm going to ask you to think about it today. And so one is think at the level of the individual, right? Individuals have spiritual principles that, you know, really help them shape their behavior and shape the way that they walk in this world. So those are things like your personal beliefs, your home culture, the way that you were nurtured and raised. It's taking personal responsibility, right? Our personal growth comes from, you know, this humble posture of learning that we're all engaged in trying to understand this, right? At an institutional level, right? It's a little different because an institution has a responsibility to safeguard the community. So spiritual principles operating at an institutional level has a kind of wider net, right, in which they have a responsibility for. They also have to ensure that the rights of the community are first, right? And so it's different than an individual. You can begin to see how this changes, right? Also, institutions should stand for justice. Right. And so when I say they should stand for justice, what does that mean? Well, there's a couple of things that we need to look at. Standing for justice, in the lens that I'm looking at it through, is really a search for truth. Right. So when I want to understand something, how am I searching for the truth? And in order to do that, we need everyone's voice to be heard, right? And so that's this, you know, this spiritual principle of universal participation, where everyone gets to participate in the search for justice, right? And everyone's voice has equal weight. And of course, the institution also is responsible for what we call community standards, which I think we would normally think of those as like policy. We would think of those as like laws, right? Those are things that we agree like uphold the community. And so institutions are responsible for those things. At the community level is where the resources need to be protected. And so when I think of resources, some of the resources, of course, most obvious come to mind are natural resources, right? But there's also other resources. For example, our children. Our children are our most precious resource, right? And so at the level of the community, spiritual principles should ensure that those resources, like our children, right, are protected, right? And so things like the environment, for example, would be developed according to the community's needs, right? Not necessarily according to one organization or one company's needs, but rather what does the community need, right? And so at the level of the community, spiritual principles operate in this way. And then, of course, because we stand on this principle of oneness, right? Then that means that there has to be equity for all beings. And when I mean equity for all beings, it's according to their capacity. So every living being has a certain capacity. So, for example, at the kingdom of bacteria, for example, right, where, you know, at the level where bacteria exist, they have a certain capacity, but their rights as equitable human beings need to be protected. But it would be different than it would be necessarily for like animals, right, which is a different kingdom. right? And then you have minerals, which is a different kingdom, right? And then of course you have human beings, which is a whole other different kingdom, right? And so these are all living beings that we live with, right? But they all need to be treated equitably according to their capacity, right? This is something that many native traditions have understood, and that we can learn from in terms of how to relate and work with spiritual principles in these different realms of being. And all of this has to be done within a learning mode, in particular today, because today we're in an age of transformation, which means that everything is changing. And so we have to be constantly striving to learn together, because we don't really know how to do this yet. Not collectively the way that we're doing it today, which is universal, right? Maybe before I knew how to do it with just my community or just my culture, right? Or just, from my background is Quechua on my father's side. So maybe just the Quechua people knew how to do it. But now we have to learn how to do it globally, right? And so that's not something that we've ever really done before. And so this is a new learning mode for us, right? So with this being kind of like the way that we're walking in, and this being our baseline of understanding, then I'm going to ask you to really think about, when addressing racism, to look at it through these two lenses. In particular, look about it at the level of the individual and at the level of institutions. And the reason I say this is because whenever racism shows up, the question we have to ask ourselves is it at the level of the individual or at the level of the institution? Because that will determine our response. Our response will be different according to which one it is. So, for example, at the personal level, right? If somebody offends me, right, then my job is to think about how am I going to respond personally, right? So if a friend says something that's offensive, because with friends we're learning always to love each other, in a place of love with each other, then I need to think about, how do I forgive this friend? How do I help develop understanding with this friend, right? So it requires certain principles of trust, of love, of humility, right? But at the level of the institution, that's different. Because if we see institutionalized oppression, so for example, there's many examples of this, right? Mass incarceration. In schools, we see that Black and brown children are often harshly punished in a way that will lead them, to that school to prison pipeline. That does not happen to their counterpart, their white and Asian counterparts. And it's for the same offenses, first-time offenders. This is not, these are not students who have had regular offenses. So when we see that level of injustice, which we have data across the country that tells us this is happening, right? Then we know, okay, this is institutional oppression. And at that level, an institution needs to deal with it. So you can't say, well, we just need to be forgiving, or because it's an institution and its oppression is much more severe because it's a whole group of students that is impacting, right? And so then in order to address institutionalized oppression, you need another institution, right, in order to address it. So another institution, for example, could be something like where we get like, the NAACP and we start working with them, or, maybe we'll work with a team of lawyers, right, that, like MALDEF does a lot of this work, right? And so you get one institution working, to like address an institutional oppression here. You still search for truth, you still seek justice, but remember the rights of the community members must be protected. That's the job of the institutions. And so the response to racism when it's institutional oppression is very different than when it's individual injury. And I often think we confuse these two, which is where, then people say, you have to be forgiving and, well, it depends, right? Which one is it, right? And so depending on the one that it is, depends on my response. And so hopefully that's helpful in thinking about it. So as we go deeper into this conversation, I'm going to ask you to carry those two lenses with you as we continue. So this concept of walking through the world with lenses, I think, is an important one, right? The way that we see the world is through multiple lenses that we carry, right? These lenses are created through our life experiences. They're created and developed through our cultures, right? The belief systems that are held within my family or within my wider culture, right? Like being Indigenous Latina, for example, or being of like a racially mixed background, right? That shapes my lens and how I view the world, right? There's false narratives that can impact my lens, right? What I've been told about women, what I've been told about being, you know, somebody who's brown, you know, like these can all impact my lens, right? So we all walk with multiple lenses that impact the way we see the world. And if we're not conscious of this, then we think the way we see the world is accurate. We think that the way I see the world is the truth and the only way to see the world. And that's very dangerous because there are multiple ways to see the world according to people's lens, right? Which is why, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, important to like sit in that, like in that space of search for truth, right? When we're looking for justice, we really want to understand what the other person is seeing, right? Now, there is a lens that if you're a person of color, you will always carry. And that's the lens of whiteness, right? Because that's the way this world was designed. So I want to talk about that a little bit. It doesn't mean that everyone else isn't impacted by this. Everyone is impacted by the lens of whiteness. It's just that if you're a person of color, you are pretty, most likely very conscious of this, right? You're conscious that, you know, there's this other lens that you have to be thinking about. It impacts the way you speak. It impacts the way you show up into a room. And you know this, right? Your friends may not know this, but you know this, right? And so that's this lens of whiteness. However, everybody has this lens because this came from colonization, right? And so this lens of whiteness, you know, is a lens that was institutionalized through colonization that really placed this color scale, right? And value according to this color scale that included one's humanity, right? And so the lighter you go up the color scale, your humanity increases. And as you drop down the color scale, your humanity decreases, right? And remember, this is institutionalized. So when something is institutionalized, it becomes part of the culture in which all people live and exist. It's become part of our belief systems. It's the way that we build our schools. It's the way we design our places of worship. Everything gets impacted by this lens of whiteness, right? In particular, if you're not conscious of it. Now remember, colonization hit the whole world. So nobody is safe from this, right? So all over the world, everyone has this lens that impacts them. And I'm sure that you can reflect, especially if you've traveled, and think of, you know, how this looks in different countries that you have traveled in, right? And so this lens of whiteness has rules that it asks individuals and institutions to follow. Right? And so here's a list of some of the rules that it asks us to engage in. One is that we must maintain silence. We can't talk about this, right? We don't talk about this is happening. And if you're not silenced, you're ridiculed if you do, right? We avoid it, right? Part of the rules within this, this institutionalized oppression is just pretend it's not there. Just pretend it's not happening, right? And so we avoid it, right? Masking, right? Where you're asked to wear a different mask in order to show up. And I want to say something about this because, again, if you're a person of color, you're real conscious of masks. You know about this. But let me say that everyone is impacted by whiteness. And so whether or not white people realize it or not, they too are asked to wear masks. Right? And so again, we want to be conscious of this, right? Because it strips us all of our humanity, right? And it's not a reflection of our true noble selves, right? And so we want to be real conscious of this. In this institution of whiteness, we also ask that there be a great deal of control, right? You have to control the messaging. You have to control the movements. You have to control how things are done, right? Because you have to preserve this. Otherwise, this could get dismantled, right? And so control happens at all levels, at an individual level, and it happens at an institutional level with policies that are created and laws that are created, right? Of course, within this institution of whiteness, there's also labeling, right? So everyone gets a label, you know, and it doesn't matter if you like it or don't like it, doesn't matter if it's coherent with who you are or not, you're gonna get a label because it helps uphold this system, right? And then of course there's attacking, right? Where we attack each other because it pits us against each other by creating this otherness among us, right? There is another group of people that is probably better than me, or there's another group of people that is not as good as me. And so it just creates this constant dichotomy among us of otherness, right? And it's why we want to be really conscious of this, because the more that we move away from this otherness, then we can start moving towards oneness. And I want to say something about a movement towards oneness. It's not sameness, right? And so we don't want to do, to oneness what when we think about colorblind, it's by no means something like colorblind. To recognize the oneness of humanity is to recognize the diversity, the beauty in the diversity, and how that lends and adds to the whole. And it is essential, right? It's not an option. It's not, it would be a nice idea. In order for our survival, right, we need all of humanity to participate. And I'm going to talk about that today in how we're going to open this up. So these ideas that I'm sharing have become part of our cultural narrative. They're just part of the way that we move, the way that we do things. It's become so kind of placed in our subconscious, right? We're not even conscious of them. We just do it, I come from, again, an indigenous Latino community on my father's side. And one of the things I always heard growing up was, when a baby was born, they'd say, ay, qué bonito, está bien güerito, right? And what does güerito mean? Oh, he's so like light skin, blonde, right? And it's just something that they just say, right? But of course, we know that comes from this lens of whiteness, and it's so unconscious. Nobody recognizes it, right? Until you recognize it. And then when you recognize it, you start taking deliberate steps to say, we can no longer do that, right? So that's how it becomes part of our cultural narrative. So how did whiteness get institutionalized? And so I want to give you just an example of how this might have happened, and why I believe this impacts everyone. Because one of the things that I hear sometimes when I have these conversations, in particular with my friends who are Anglo, is they'll say, yeah, but I wasn't the one that enslaved, or my ancestors didn't enslave people, or my ancestors are the recent immigrants, I didn't do it, and I understand that. However, again, whiteness is not concerned about whether or not this is true, coherent, reflection of you. Whiteness is going to strip everyone of their humanity, and that includes white people, right? And so this is an example of how whiteness gets institutionalized. I currently have the opportunity and truly the blessing, because the land that I'm standing on belonged to the Amamatsan people, which is in Santa Cruz, California. It's in Northern California. And in this land, there was a man, his name was Dave Boffman, and he arrived at this land enslaved, right? And he was African-American, he arrived enslaved. And the person that had enslaved him said, if you work off, the enslavement, then you could be free. And so and so he did. And he worked it off, and then he continued to work in the mines and continued to work in different ways, and, earned money, and was able to buy 46,000 acres, right, of land. And, if you've ever been to Santa Cruz area, which is just an incredible area, the Amamatsan people did such a beautiful job of caring for this land for 10,000 years. Then you know what a gift that was, right? That he was able to get 46,000 acres of land up here. And he had a ranch. It was a working ranch. He had, horse, cattle, just really, really doing well. And there was a local sheriff at that time. And there's different versions of this story. I've read multiple. Some say that the sheriff was jealous, others say that the sheriff knew that he was an honest man, but, still just wanted to try to extract money from him. Whatever the case may be, the sheriff accused him of lying, of stealing a horse. And, Dave said, no, I didn't do this, but he said, no, you did it, and I'm gonna take you to court. Now, why this is so significant is because at that time there existed a law in California. It was called the African American and Native Testimony Exclusion Act, right? It might have been Black and Native Testimony Exclusion Act. And what this law said in California was that a Black man or a Black woman and a Native person could not testify against a white person in court, right? So he takes him to court and he cannot testify and defend himself in court. And because of this act, and because of this law, he lost all of his land, right? So the judge said, well, then, obviously you did it. And so he lost all of his land. He had a little bit left of like some cows. And when the sheriff found out about this little bit that he had left, he went after that as well and said, you know, like the debt hasn't been paid yet. I need that as well. And took that. And in the end, Dave Boffman ended up living in a small shack that he built by a creek in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Now, when I think about the injustice of this, of course I get angry, right? Because it seems so just insanely unfair. But what's more important for me in terms of this conversation today is how that institutionalized whiteness. Because in essence, what that law said is that the value of a white person's voice was more than a Native or a Black person, right? And they were institutionalizing this by making this a law. And so when you institutionalize something like this, it becomes part of the culture, and it becomes part of the way that we think and the way that we do things. So even though once you remove the law, still we will continue to think this way until we consciously begin to remove it, right? We will still think that when we see someone who is Black or Native, most likely they're not telling the truth. But if we see a white person in court and testifying, then we think that, yes, they must be telling the truth, right? And this is how whiteness gets institutionalized. And so these are things that we need to know about so that we can very consciously remove this from where I say we remove it from is our heart, because our heart has become prejudiced when we allow these things to penetrate into who we are, right? So when I'm in this conversation with you, you're going to find I'm going to talk a lot about these kind of things, because it is not enough to change the laws, and it's not enough to change the policy if you don't change the heart of the human being, because the heart is ultimately where everything gets built from. And so we need to shift the heart to the truth. So with this in mind, I want to talk a little bit about the power of words, because all of this is built on the power of words, right? The fact that people express something and then that impacts not only that person, but the culture, the policies, and the institutions, right? The whole community gets impacted by the words that we express, right? These two quotes I so appreciate. One of these quotes, in this first one, it talks about every word is endowed with a spirit, right? Baha'u'llah was one of the greatest luminaries of our time, and he talks about how every word is endowed with a spirit. And you imagine when you say something, it has a spirit with it and it releases it. And so wouldn't we want to then say things that are beautiful, say things that are reflections of the truth of humanity, right? And the only way we do that is if we believe it in our heart, right? The other quote, which I so appreciate, and one of my beloved sisters from the Diné Nation, or what we commonly know as the Navajo Nation, when I was doing this, preparing for this, she shared this with me, and she said, it's true that words, have power, but what makes them so powerful, right? And why they still matter is when the effects of the history of those words are still felt today. And I thought that was a reflection again of how the spirit of the word continues to live, right? So I want to give you an example of this, of how that, so we're not talking in abstract, so we're actually talking about something that's very real and tangible. We can, see it in front of us. And this, this is an example that Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, talks about. One of the things that she said is that, when the English came, when the Europeans came first to this land, initially the relationship with the native people was not necessarily, contentious, right? The native people said, of course you can live here. The land doesn't, we share the land, we work together, right? And so they were here. However, when the Europeans wanted more land and they wanted to take the land, the native people then said, no, that's not, we don't take the land, right? That's not how we work with the land. And it was at that point then that, because it no longer worked with what the Europeans needed, that they changed the language around the native people, and they began to call them savages. Now, just that one word, remember, every word has a spirit, just that one word, they changed that word. And now everyone's perception around native people became, oh, they're savage. And because of that, then it's okay if I take out an entire village, because after all, they're really just savage people, right? It's okay that we use small toddlers as target practice, because after all, they're not really, you know, like us, they're savage, right? And so that one word changed everything in the way that Native people were treated, right? And how institutionalized oppression began to impact them. And so that's an example of how the power of words, right, can begin to really influence the culture around us. Of course, the exciting thing, and we're going to do this in the second hour, and Roya is going to help us with this, is that we can also build with the power of words, right? And this is how the power of words destroyed a whole people, not just the Native people. It destroyed white people too, right? Because it destroys you when you treat your brother and sister this way, especially when you don't know they're your brother and sister, right? So again, this concept of how language can really impact and institutionalize things that today we see as normal, right? And what I call these are narratives that are sanitized through whiteness, right? And so for when I think about narratives, there are two kinds of narratives that I always think about. I think there are inner narratives that we each carry inside of us, stories about who we are. Some are true, some are most definitely not true, right? And then there's social narratives that society tells, right? And so we need to look at both of them because they were both impacted by this, right? And so when we think about inner narratives, remember part of what was driving whiteness was also this like competition, right? You know, like who's going to get to the top? The top is the best. No, I got to scale it and get up there, right? Because that's the best, right? The thing is, you're never going to make it, right? Because even if you're the whitest white and got all the stuff going on, there's probably somebody else who's a little better than you. And so you have to always be working, right? And I think that what that does is it creates this false narrative of never being good enough. I always have to keep striving. And I think this has been institutionalized in the work that I've done with healing work in particular. It's a narrative that always comes up no matter who I'm working with. It comes up again and again, right? So I think this not good enough comes from this drive of competition, right? Which again is also bred by individualism, right? And so that's one way in which I think it's impacted our inner narratives, right? Then we have social narratives, right? And so our social narratives, for example, medicines, right? When we say, I'm going to go see the doctor, most of us will think about Western medicine, right? Now, the way that medicines have been talked about is that we've talked about like, well, you have Western medicine, and then if you know like that doesn't work out, or you want to like add on an alternative medicine, like that's okay, right? But we don't really see, for example, medicine men and medicine women as real doctors, even though in order to be a medicine man or medicine woman, you have to apprentice for 10 years with an already established medicine man or medicine woman, which is equivalent to the amount of time that one goes to school in a Western institution, right? Except that they're doing it in real life, real time application, right? The other thing that I think about when I think about medicine is I think about our ancient Chinese medicine, right? Oh, you know, the ancient Chinese medicine, over 5,000 years. I mean, how amazing, how much learning have they amassed, right? And yet we call this, you know, oh, you know, just you can get acupuncture if you want, if your insurance covers it. I don't know if it does, you know, because we don't see it in the same way that we see Western medicine. That to me is where that narrative has been sanitized by whiteness. If we truly saw all our medicines under the lens of the oneness of humanity, all of those would be equal in value. And you know, like I know that if all of those were at the table collaborating, how much would we get done? I mean, how incredible to have the wisdom of the Chinese medicine at the table, the wisdom of the indigenous and native medicine men and women at the table, the African medicine at the table, all of these, and the Western at the table, collaborating with the same vision of oneness, right? They know that what they're saying has equal weight and value. How many things would we get solved, right? Like how many diseases would be solved, right? So again, these narratives that have been sanitized through whiteness. I mean, I can go through this list, you know, just, you know, what we say about, you know, science. What is true science? You know, it always has to go through the scientific method. But the question I always ask myself is, what did the Mayans do? We know that the Mayans were extraordinary scientists and mathematicians. what was their method? Surely they had a method. And what could that help us understand about the universe, right? So again, these are things that we're not accessing because all these narratives have been sanitized through whiteness, and we don't value them as equal to the Western, medicine or Western science, right? So this is interesting, but how does it impact us today, right? And I just want to, kind of share a little bit about how it might be impacting us today. Sorry, let's see if I can get there it goes. So this is, this is an example of this person here is me. When I was in my 20s, I had an opportunity to go to the rainforest in Colombia, and I was working with the UA people. And the UA people live rather remotely. They're not necessarily like the Amazon rainforest people where they completely have had no contact. They've had some, but very, very remote. And they have very little contact. Primarily what they do is they send their chiefs down, and their chiefs will come down, and then, they'll come back up if they have something. But they generally are very, very remote. And so I was there working with them for a few weeks, and Elder was walking me through the rainforest, and my hand just happened to brush upon some plant, just brushed it lightly. Within seconds, my hand swelled up and turned black. I was terrified, and I said, "Oh my gosh, I'm in the middle of this rainforest. What are they going to do? They're going to have to cut it off." Like, I was so frightened, right? And the elder, he was one of the chiefs. He was very calm, and he said, "Go down to the bottom of this hill, and you'll see this river, And he said, "I want you to stick your hand deep into the water and into the mud, and leave it there for about 10 minutes or so." And I remember looking at him thinking, like, "That's it?" And I said, "Okay." And so I did this, right? I went and I just plunged my hand in. And so I told someone, "You have to take a picture of me doing this because no one will believe me," right? And when I pulled my hand out, it was completely normal. It was fine, right? Now, one small example, right, of what is deep within, the rainforest among the friends that live there, right? But when we stray from spiritual solutions, what happens is something like this, right? This is also the Colombian rainforest, right? And part of what happens with this is this, right? So, beef and dairy companies need to clear land in order to graze, their cows, right? And so the principle that they're using is the principle of consumerism, right? Not the principle of oneness, right? And so these are things that we want to be thinking about. Because this is very real. This is in real time, right? We're missing something when we're missing, an entire understanding about how to work with nature when we have these kind of examples that are happening to us. Another example of how this is impacting us, how these narratives sanitized through whiteness are impacting us, is this. If you live in California, you recognize this, right? This is the wildfires that we've had in California this summer. And what I keep hearing on the news is it's unprecedented. This is historic in nature. Never had we had these type of, wildfires before. And so I began to dig a little deeper, and I wanted to understand, why is this happening? Because I really trust the indigenous people of the land that I live in, and I wanted to know, like, was this normal? And if it is, maybe they can help us. And and so I was digging a little deeper, and there's multiple reasons, of course, climate change, man interacting with nature probably at a much more intense level than before. But one of the things that emerged was that they had, about 80 years ago, they had a decision to make. And when I say they, it's whoever was in power at that time. So what that was, most likely white males, right? And so they had a decision to make. Do we suppress fires, or do we use controlled burning, right? Now, not really, this is not my area of expertise. This is not an area I've dove into, right? But the question that I asked myself when they made that decision, because what they decided was suppression. They decided to suppress fires, right? The question I asked myself was, did they consult these friends? right? Because these friends are the friends from the Amamatsun tribe, right? And they have an understanding of how to work with the land that we live in. But when we don't consult with the people who are, you know, from this area, or when we don't consult with everyone, right? With everyone that brings understanding to the table and hold what they say as equal to what we have, then we lose. And California experienced that this summer, right? We lost because we did not listen to everyone and what they had to say about how to care for the land here in California. So it's just, these are examples of how we are losing as humanity, right? Because we refuse to include everyone at the table in universal participation when it comes to these issues. So I don't have to tell you it's an urgent issue. You know it's an urgent issue, right? Hopefully this helps with understanding some of this. And so when Roya and I were reflecting on this, you know, one of the things that we thought of is we need a redesign, right? We need to redesign this whole thing. Now, not by a long shot do we think that we have a solution, or do we think that this is the way. However, we want to contribute to our thinking. We want to contribute to how we're thinking about this process. So I'm going to hand it over to Roya to kind of help us really think about the redesign, which I think is the most exciting part, is really this part, right? Because we know the past was horrific. So where are we going? You know, take us somewhere different.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ima. So we wanted to use something it's called design thinking process. And I'm just kind of going to go over it here with you guys to help us kind of think about what would it look like to redesign a world, a system where the principle of the oneness humanity is central to everything. And something I think both Ima and I really valued about this process is it involves everybody's voices and equal. And I think justice demands universal participation from everybody in building a new system. And so we wanted to try this with everybody here. Okay, so the first step is empathize. And so in that step, we're really understanding what the issue is, like what the needs of the community are, not necessarily what I think the needs are or what research says, but really understanding the problem and how it's affecting people. And then the next is to define the problem. So based on what the community's needs are, what they've shared, to really like pull out insights and understand what the problem is. And then ideate is the next step, and that's to kind of brainstorm collaboratively with a diverse group of people, come up with ideas, consult, and then that will lead us to the prototype, which is to kind of create a draft of the solution and then go and test it and share it with the community. And then the community is really the one who's shaping it, helping give feedback, and it's an iterative process. So it's not just like one and done. It's like probably be a very long process of refining and learning and reflecting and acting together. Okay, so then the next slide. Ima, how do I? Okay, thanks. Okay, so okay, the first step is empathize. So I'm gonna send